Hello, I'm Reese Ryan, and this week I'm like Mariah Carey, all by myself, as Nathan is with us in spirit as he takes his long service leave after removing his wisdom teeth. So fingers crossed he's still got some wisdom left for next week. As I was lucky to speak with Jennifer Piscopo from Occidental College all the way in Los Angeles. It was a phenomenal chat as we spoke about what is actually going on in Chile. The Chileans have voted to rewrite their constitution, which isn't something that happens every day. Jennifer walked me through what is actually happening and how a rise in train fares sparked massive protests. As we will see, the increase in train fares was the straw that broke the camel's back, and it was the tip of the iceberg on a whole raft of issues that have plagued Chile, which includes increased cost of living and great inequality in the country. Also, keep an eye out or an ear out for Jennifer almost breaking the Guinness Book of World Records for most metaphors said in a podcast. As I know Nathan would be telling me, just focus, Reese. Let's get this show on the road. So let's do that by getting stuck in with another Glad You Do Politics podcast. Jennifer, I was interested, where did your love of Latin American studies come from? Because it seems quite original.
That's a great question. So obviously I'm American, and I grew up in the Northeast of the United States. So I grew up in Massachusetts. And so that's a place where it's the cradle of the American Revolution. So, back in the 1780s when the American colonists rose up against the British. So, growing up, you grow up sort of steeped in this mythology of the American Revolution. All your school field trips take you to see important sites. So when I was a bit older, I got to learn about Latin America in my high school and secondary school. It was a moment where Latin American countries were democratizing sort of in that moment, right? They were exiting military dictatorships. They were exiting civil wars. And I was really drawn by this notion that countries could be democratizing in my lifetime, that democracy could be an active process that was happening today, because of course I'd grown up with this notion of it being quite old, right? It being 200 years old. So that's how I became really interested in Latin American politics. And then it followed me through university and on into my doctorate degree.
So that mean you adopted the Latin American culture along the journey, or?
I did. There's things that I absolutely love. So I have tacos for breakfast every morning. So I have a Mexican breakfast every morning, even when I'm not in Mexico. And of course I speak Spanish, and, I've traveled throughout the region. And since then I've lived in Mexico and in Chile and in Costa Rica and Argentina. And it's just been a super fantastic journey to get to know these countries and get to know the people and bring some of that home with me, and also bring some of myself to them.
Oof, I know when I'm coming to Los Angeles, I'm coming for the tacos here, Jennifer.
Mexican breakfast is fantastic. I highly recommend some fried eggs, some corn tortillas, and some hot sauce. It'll be a great start to your day.
Nothing gets any better, I don't think. I'm very jealous. So you're saying you've lived in Chile, and that right. Would have been an interesting time. How long ago was that?
So my most extended periods in Chile were recently, actually. I first went to Chile in 2009, but I spent the most time there recently in about 2015 and then in 2016. So even before we get to Chile's recent moment, in 2015 and 2016, Chile made a very big change to its election system. It sort of threw out the way that it actually ran elections and had run elections since 1990, and put in place a brand new way of electing members of Congress. So if you're a political science geek like me, when countries do these sorts of things, they don't do them very often. You really want to watch what happens, because when there's a different election system in place, it completely changes the calculations that people make about running for office. It can completely change who gets elected to office. So I spent a lot of time in Chile around that set of reforms, talking to women candidates, talking to party leaders, and really trying to understand how they were grappling with this new election system.
Yeah, it's just so fascinating for me. But I think there's a little bit longer history for our people or listeners who aren't aware of what's happened in the last few years in Chile. Can you help us understand a little bit more how this has led to the present? Because I don't think this has happened in the space of 4 or 5 years.
Exactly. So I think the most history to make sense is to start with is sort of 1973, right? So, Chile was a democratic country, and they had a democratically elected president, a man by the name of Salvador Allende, and he came from the Socialist Party. So now let's go back to the 1970s. The world in the 1970s is in the Cold War, right? So Russia and the United States are the poles, and Russia represents the communist world, and the US represents what it calls, right, the free world, the non-communist world. And so anytime a government, right, that was socialist or communist inspired was elected, it was a cause for concern, right? So Chile democratically elects a socialist president in the early 1970s. So Salvador Allende was not a communist in the way Russia was communist at the time. He was a socialist, but he ran on a platform of sort of redistributing land and redistributing income to favor the poor. And so this was really threatening to Western American interests, right? Because what they did not want in the 1960s and 1970s were socialist or communist countries in the Western Hemisphere, right? In their backyard. So in 1973, Salvador Allende was deposed in a military coup led by the Chilean government, but with assistance from the United States. And so what was installed and then in 1973 was a military government that governed Chile from 1973 until 1990. And the head of that government was a man named Augusto Pinochet. And that was a really dark time for Chileans' history. Civil rights and political rights were suspended. There were no political parties. There were no elections. Individuals who were thought to be sympathetic to Allende and his left-leaning agenda were kidnapped by the military dictatorship. They were detained. They were tortured. People could not meet and speak freely for a very long period of time. In 1980, the Pinochet government, led by Pinochet, wrote a constitution, but this constitution had a lot of limitations, right? And in 1988 and in 1989, as the Pinochet dictatorship started to lose power, there was a referendum in Chile on whether or not Chileans wanted to continue living under the Pinochet government. The Pinochet government lost that referendum. They had to yield power, and they had to transition to free and fair elections. Now, they transitioned to free and fair elections in 1990, so Chile became a democracy again in 1990, but they continued to have this 1980 constitution structuring a lot of how democracy worked. So some of the things that constitution did was continue to put a lot of power in the hands of the president and a lot of power in the hands of the constitutional court. So that meant the Congress couldn't really make a lot of laws. If Congress wanted to make laws, another thing the Constitution required were very high quorums, right? So they had to have sort of everyone there in order to vote, which is sort of another barrier to making laws. Another part of that Constitution was the election system. It was a very peculiar election system. It didn't exist anywhere else in the world. And it was designed specifically to keep left parties from winning a lot of votes, to prevent the left from ever really getting an electoral majority and electing a socialist president again. So those reforms that I mentioned in 2015 and 2016 were really a long time coming, because between 1990 and 2015, when you had a political system that kept the left from winning, that concentrated power in the hands of the president at the expense of Congress, you didn't have a country that made a lot of changes, right? So people became more and more frustrated with what they felt was as my co-author says, an insular and unresponsive political class, right? Folks that were just kind of governing, but not really making any changes. The economy was booming, but the rich were getting richer and the poor were more or less staying the same. So Chile did try to make a big set of reforms in this 2015-2016 period, right? They said they finally got enough majority to say, okay, we're going to get rid of the election system. We're going to put in place a new election system that works a little bit more democratic, gives the political parties a bit more of an equal playing field. and see how that works. And so I'll pause the story there, but the spoiler alert is that those big reforms in 2015 and 2016 turned out to be insufficient to address sort of Chileans' growing frustrations with just this stagnant political system that, even though it was democratic, nothing was really changing, and they had been living this way since about the 90s.
Wow. We're speaking about breakfast before, but I think, you would absolutely be eating up all the history with Salvador Allende and Pinochet. Oh my goodness. It's just like a morning stroll for you this morning. Jennifer, our time. I think that's what's so interesting as well. The Constitution isn't a neutral document, but something that's usually written to favour one group over the other. I know when we just did the Bolivian podcast in our last episode, we talked about how Bolivia and their constitution is favoured certain groups, such as the miners, the mine owners. So is there one party, or is there one part of life that is favoured with this new constitution?
Right. So we talked about Chile reforming the election system, right, in 2015 and in 2016. But there was a lot of hopes put in that election system, and so Chile had elections in 2017, and a sort of newer Congress was elected. But last year in 2019. Just last year, a year ago, when the Chilean government, which had a right-wing president at the time, and a right-wing president, I should say, with ties to the military dictatorship, the government hiked public transit fares. And so you wouldn't think hiking public transit fares is a big deal, except I mentioned that Chile is a deeply unequal country, right? So the rich control about 40% of the income, and the rich and the poor really live in two different worlds, right? So there's parts of the capital, Santiago, where life expectancy looks like Sweden and life outcomes look like Sweden. And there's parts of the capital, Santiago, where life outcomes look like a very poor global south country that you would not sign up to be a tourist to. So when the government hiked public transit fares, that hike would have meant for Chileans making minimum wage, they would now have to spend 14% of their daily income just to ride the metro. That's enormous. So that was really a spark, and it was the straw that broke the camel's back. So last October, millions of Chileans, all of a sudden, they took to the streets. The country just exploded in protests. We can talk more about the protests. They lasted a really long time. There was a lot of violence. But one of the things that came out of that was Congress and the president realized that it hadn't been enough to reform the new election system. They were going to have a deeper set of reforms. So what they agreed on was a referendum that happened last week. And that was a referendum, and it asked Chileans two questions. It asked them, should the country scrap the 1980 constitution that we inherited from Augusto Pinochet? And it didn't say scrap, but it was asked more formally, but I'm giving you the kind of narrative version, right?
Close enough.
So if you want to scrap the Constitution, who should write the new Constitution? And they had two options. Both options entailed convening a constitutional convention, which would be a special assembly or a special Congress to write a constitution. One option was an assembly or a convention composed entirely of everyday citizens. And the other was an option composed of half everyday citizens and half sitting members of Congress. So in that referendum, nearly 80% of Chileans chose to write a new constitution, and nearly 80% of Chileans chose to have everyday Chileans write it. So that's how we get to your question about what's going to happen with this new constitution. The referendum that happened last week, it really is just the beginning. So Chileans voted for a new constitution. They voted to have it be written by everyday Chileans. But who are those everyday Chileans going to be? So what happens in Chile next is going to be a process that will take over a year. People will declare their candidacies to sit in the Constitutional Convention, just like you would declare your candidacy to run for office. Political parties will run these candidates. There'll be elections, and then the convention will actually sit as a body and start to make decisions about the new constitution. So the question about what this new constitution will say, what kind of groups it will give benefits and rights to, is really going to depend on who exactly are these everyday Chileans who are going to decide they want to write the Constitution and who are going to run and who are actually going to be elected.
It's almost a bit like Watch This Space at the moment, and we're going to have to see what happens. I almost think as well, just looking into Sebastián Pinera, the Chilean president, his plan almost backfired with increasing the prices of going on the train or the transit fares. We've now all these conversations on Zoom, Jennifer.
I think the Piñera decision, right, really speaks to some of the problems that caused Chile to get to this place, which is the kind of way in which members of the political class were really out of touch with the concerns of everyday Chileans. This old election system before it was scrapped in 2015, in addition to preventing political parties of the left from winning a lot, it created a large incumbency advantage, right? So people could just be reelected and reelected. And there's really good reasons to have incumbents in Congress, right? So I don't want you to take away from this message that we shouldn't have incumbents, right? Incumbents are important because lawmakers in any democratic country, get better at making laws over time, right? So a lot of turnover is often not a good thing. However, right, one thing that an incumbency advantage can do is sort of disincentivize those members of Congress to be paying attention to their constituents if they know that their re-election is sort of always guaranteed. So that's the downside, right? So, when Piñera makes the decision to raise transit fares, it's more broadly talking about how, the same people were president in Chile and were members of Congress in Chile. Piñera was serving his second term. He had been elected president before, right? And so that, it was just this frustration from the citizens with the out of touchness of their politicians and large amounts of economic inequality, right? So that citizens are thinking, how could these politicians make us spend 14% of our daily income to ride the metro to work or not? Like, you're literally losing money when you try to go to work to make money. So I think that was part of the spark there.
Yeah, that just broke the camel's back, as you said.
Exactly. And so when the protests started, what were people really angry about? You had students that were angry about the high cost of education and the huge disparities between the elite universities that the wealthy could pay for, that are as good as Australia National University or as good as Harvard, and the awful universities that you had to go to if you were poor, right? That didn't really make you competitive in the labor market. People were angry about their pensions, that they had no money to retire on, right? Workers were angry about their overall low salaries. If you were poor in Chile and needed to go to the doctor, you had to pay for your own bandages, your own syringes, right? Your own medications. But the wealthy could go to private hospitals with doctors trained in US and Europe and get as good of health care as you would get in the best hospitals in New York City or in Melbourne, right? And so people were angry about this. Women were angry about sexual harassment, violence against women. Divorce wasn't legal in Chile until 2004. So there was a lot of frustration from women and from feminists about gender inequality in addition to social and economic inequality. So exactly, those transit fares, my colleague has this cartoon that he shows, right? And it's an iceberg. And at the very tip of the iceberg is the transit fares, and there's the ocean. And then below the ocean are all of the other issues that I talked about. And that's really what led Chileans to take to the street. And that's really what forced the government's decision to have this referendum.
So really, if this transit fare wasn't hiked, this protest would have never happened over the last couple of years.
Or something else would have done it, right? Okay. I mean, if you think about that tip of the iceberg analogy, right, where there's all of these other issues, right? Women are frustrated, right? Workers are frustrated. Students are frustrated. So if it hadn't been the transit fare hike, maybe it would have been some other out of touch decision, right? That was just simply too much. So you could think about the analogy where we've said the straw breaks the camel's back, but also think about the frog in the boiling pot, right? And eventually the water just gets so hot that the frog leaps out of the pot. And so if it wasn't transit fares that caused the frog to leap, it might have been something else.
I think I would love to know more about the role of women in Chile. As I saw in December 2019, a law was passed which established that half of the citizens who will write Chile's new constitution must be women. This doesn't seem groundbreaking for global standards, But for women in politics in Chile, this seems enormous.
Well, it's actually even pretty groundbreaking for global standards. There's been no constitution in the globe that has ever been written with half women in the room, right? Women just have not been part of constitution-making processes. So Chile will now become the first country in the world to write a constitution where half women are present. But I think to understand that, we have to kind of go back a little bit, right? So, women have long been excluded from political processes, right? And most elected positions in the world and in countries are held by men. So more broadly speaking, when Latin America transitioned to democracy in 1990, right, Chile wasn't the only country to transition to democracy starting in the 1990s. Women were frustrated by how the democratic transitions, the return to electoral competition, and the return to party politics, they were frustrated by the fact that they didn't have a lot of opportunities in that moment to actually run for and compete for office. So in Chile's neighbor, Argentina, women fought and won what's called a gender quota law. So in 1991, Argentina became the first country to pass a gender quota law. What that law means is that political parties have to run what was then 30% women candidates. And it was a mechanism to really accelerate the pace of change of women getting into elected positions. And so once Argentina did that in 1991, other Latin American countries and other countries across the globe followed. So today, there's actually 80 countries in the world that have some form of gender quota law. So we find these in Latin America, we find them in Europe, we find them in East Asia, in the MENA region, Middle East and North Africa region. So they're kind of the norm now in democracies, right? To really require that political parties actively have women participating. So when Chile reformed its election system in 2015, it included a 40% gender quota for women candidates. That was part of that 2015-2016 new election system design. That's really important. It resulted in about 24% women getting elected to the Congress in the 2017 elections. Okay, so now people are protesting in the streets. The political elites, the president and Congress, have to make a decision about this referendum on the Constitutional Convention. And so they have to kind of negotiate what the terms of the Constitutional Convention will be so that when voters go to the polls and they cast their ballots, voters know what they're voting for. So there was a large number of women in Congress at this point, about 24%. There's an enormous feminist and women's movement in civil society in the streets, right, marching against violence against women. They know each other, right? I mean, they're in networks, they're working together. So their plan was, we are going to insist that the Citizens Constitutional Convention have a 50% gender quota for women candidates. Okay, that's not that radical, right? Gender quotas for women candidates have existed a long time. In fact, Tunisia, in the Arab Spring, for its constitutional convention, required a 50% gender quota for women candidates. But the women in Chile were like, we're going to go further. Because notice that you can run a certain proportion of women candidates, but that doesn't mean they win, right? Chile had a 40% gender quota. 40% women ran in 2017, but only about 24% women won. In Tunisia, when 50% women ran for the constitutional convention that Tunisia had, only about a quarter of them won. So Chilean women were like, well, it's not enough to say that we have gender parity in the candidacies, because what if the women don't win? We want the Constitution to be written with a gender parity body. So they said, you need to go further. If 50% women don't win the elections, we need to redistribute the votes such that 50% women do win. So what that will mean is when they hold these elections for the citizen delegates of the Constitutional Convention, and if 50% women don't win outright, what we call the worst winning men, meaning the men who win but win with the least votes, they're going to get bumped and they're going to be replaced with what we would call the worst losing women, right? Meaning the women who lost but got the most votes among the losers. So they will actually redistribute the victories after the election to ensure that that body that writes the new constitution is 50-50. That is actually radical. There is no other country in the world that does anything like that for its congressional elections, and definitely never for a constitutional convention.
Can't believe how wrong I was here, Jennifer. I'm sorry.
That's okay. I mean, that's why it's really fun to talk about these things, because it's sort of hard to conceptualize, but it's really amazing. And I think that it really can show other countries what can be done if you were just think outside the box a little bit, right?
Yeah. Well, that's why we're here. We're trying to look outside the box. Do you see other countries might look to Chile as a source of inspiration?
I think so. One of the sort of discussions around gender quotas has exactly been this, right? The quota is usually for candidates. And so how do you convert those candidacies into victories, right? There's a few variants of gender quotas across the globe where their quotas are not for candidates. The quotas are actually for a certain number of seats in Congress. But that's never 50%, right? It's never 50% of the seats. So even on Sunday, I was like sort of tweeting about, what you should be watching for in the constitutional, in Chile's vote today. And because I've also done a lot of work, for instance, with legislators in Costa Rica. So Costa Rica is a great case. They have a 50% quota for women candidates, but they don't necessarily elect 50% women. So I'm there on Sunday night, like just, tweeting. And some of the Costa Rican legislators that I've worked with before and that I've met and who follow me on Twitter, like saw my tweets and then they were like, oh, could we do this in Costa Rica? Like, could we go even further and think about redistributing our votes in the same way? And that's not actually unique because when I talk about sort of gender quotas from Argentina in 1991, spreading across the globe, we know that women and feminist movements, like other movements, even though they're working for change within their own country, they're partnering with, they're talking to, they're collaborating with their peers in other countries. So they know exactly the kinds of reforms that other countries have made, and they're constantly trying to learn and emulate each other, right? Chile will be the first in the world, but hopefully it won't be to have a gender parity convention, but hopefully it won't be the last.
Fingers crossed here.
That's right. That's right.
I also feel like when we talk about supposedly radical ideas, the word radical seems to people like it's a bad thing. The word radical seems to connotate something bad. Why do you think this?
Yeah, I mean, I'll think about this like a political scientist, right? And since we're talking about Chile, I'll talk about Chile. I mean, one of the things that what we call the status quo, the situation that we are in right now, we all sort of know how to live within the status quo, right? So why did it take Chile 25 years to kind of change its election system from 1990 to 2015? Well, there were a lot of problems with it, but political parties knew the rules of that election system. They knew how to play within those rules. They knew how to ensure that their candidates could get elected in the districts that they wanted to. So if you make a big change, now all of a sudden you don't quite know how to navigate or get what you want in the new system, right? So I think that all of us sort of know how to navigate the world that we're in right now. And then when it changes, people feel at sea, they feel at loss, right? They don't know how to pursue their own interests. They don't know how to ensure that their goals are going to be met, right? So if you think about these kinds of changes around, say, women in politics, for some, it can really transform their understandings of men and women. It might transform understandings of what people in their own families can do, what people in their own families and communities should be doing. And that can be really disorienting, right? Because any change sort of changes the rules. And when the rules change, suddenly we are a little bit more uncertain about how we're going to pursue our goals. And sometimes that uncertainty is really hard. And so that can be why it takes a long time to make change. Radical is often like a way to characterize the degree of change, right? So changes that go very far from the status quo. Writing a new constitution is going to go really far from the status quo, right? Because it's not just like, you could now like pay this much to use the metro, now you have to pay this much. It's literally, a whole new way of thinking about your society. I think that can be scary. It can be really scary for people who benefit from the current system. So for instance, in Santiago, the capital, in the 3 wealthiest districts, they voted against a new constitution, right? But the other districts voted for a new constitution, Why? Because in the current system, if you are wealthy, you actually have quite a good life. You actually benefit quite a lot. So to vote for a new constitution might change, right? It might introduce some changes that change your quality of life. And so, you don't want that to happen. So I think that's some of the ways that we can think about it.
Yeah, I'm now trying to think, how do we bring more of these groups together to see more change in Chile?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. So, of course, for the 20% of Chileans who did not want a new constitution, right? For the members of those wealthy districts in Santiago who don't want a new constitution, what are they worried about? They're worried that now the constitution is going to be written by sort of everyday people in the streets, and it's going to be a really, to use your word, radical document. So for instance, that the new constitution might require that every Chilean is guaranteed universal free healthcare, and that the government will be on the hook forevermore for paying out large sums of money for this, right? So now there's a lot of fear from the kind of traditional political class, the wealthy, that things are going to change really dramatically, right? But that's actually probably not going to happen. And so here's a few reasons why. So citizens are still going to have to run to be elected to the Constitutional Convention, right? So it's not quite that you're just plucking, a waiter or a waitress or a subway train driver and saying, hey, go write the Constitution. People are still going to need to run. So there's certain kinds of resources that you are going to need to be a candidate. Probably going to need to have some level of education. You're definitely going to need to have some money because you have to pay for your campaign to be elected. And you have to be nominated by a political party. So you're going to have some connection to actually the traditional politicians. So it's probably not going to be the case that everybody is going to be able to be a candidate for the convention, even though it's called a Citizens Constitutional Convention. Chile also has a large middle upper class, whether they're on the left or on the right, of people who are university professors, right? People who work for think tanks, businessmen, businesswomen, right? Lawyers. I would expect that those kinds of people would run, right? And those are not necessarily your anarchists, right? But these are probably reasonable people, maybe more lefty, maybe more righty, that have some level of education, but are interested in being part of this process. So you're already going to have a sorting out based on the fact that you have to run. Once the Constitutional Convention is seated, the rules require that any element of the Constitution, any element, needs to be approved by 2/3 of the Assembly. That's a huge, what we call majority. That's a supermajority. And it essentially is going to force consensus within that body. So even if all the citizens elected are what we hope they will be, they'll be half women. Some of them will be Indigenous, because there's also reserved seats for Indigenous peoples in this body. And we expect them to be diverse, right? Left, right, some school teachers, some university professors, some lawyers, some people in business. But for 2/3, they're all going to have to agree. That's going to pull this new constitution towards the center. So, what I've been talking about a lot is these kinds of fears now that this constitution is going to be some radical, populist, super leftist document are really overblown, because Chileans, living up to their reputation, wrote a bunch of rules to make it happen that are going to favor gradual change.
Yeah, hopefully, that gradual change will be a massive shift for the whole of Chile itself. Also, what you mentioned, the Indigenous people too, Jennifer, and I find it quite challenging to wrap my head around why haven't the Mapuche, I hope I've pronounced that correctly, Jennifer, I don't know if you could help me out there.
We would say Mapuche.
Mapuche. Yeah. Almost. My Spanish
almost.
Class has still got a long way to go here, Jennifer, to get to your level.
The fact that the fact that we're having this conversation is perfect. It's fantastic.
I love it here, Jennifer. So why haven't the Mapuche? It's
okay. You're doing great.
The Mapuche people have not been on the Constitution in the first place.
Yeah, so Chile, like a lot of Latin American countries, and like a lot of other colonial countries, my own included, Australia, right, does not have a history of treating its indigenous peoples well or justly in any sense of the word, right? So indigenous peoples in Chile suffered extermination in large scale during the times of Spanish colonization. And when, Chile, like its Latin American peers, became independent of Spain and established their own governments, they continued to discriminate and marginalize the indigenous peoples. So in Chile, for instance, the Mapuche have had their lands appropriated. They've had their lands taken by the government and sold off to private interests like mining interests. They are among the most poor Chileans. They face some of the poorest public services and access to public goods. So it's terrible, and it's a legacy of genocide and exclusion that unfortunately is not unique to Chile, but is very much real in Chile. So part of thinking about this new constitution and making it a citizens' document that could be more broadly accepted and more broadly inclusive, the topic of ensuring representation for indigenous peoples was really important. They are still negotiating what those indigenous reservations, meaning the reserved seats in the convention, what they'll look like, how they'll actually work. So we have a lot of clarity on how the Constitutional Convention will get to gender parity, because that's already been set out. We don't quite have clarity on exactly how many indigenous peoples will have access to those reserved seats, how those indigenous peoples will be selected, but they are negotiating right now in Chile those terms.
Yeah, I hope they get the services and attention they've been lacking for so long in Chilean history. It almost breaks your heart feeling for these marginalised people in our society. However, when I've looked at the reports, Jennifer, and I've seen all this discussion about the social unrest this is going to lead to, and I've been quite amazed. You spoke about the role of women earlier, and the protest initiative and the choreographed dance against domestic violence was just mind-blowing. Can you tell us more about the protest itself and the other initiatives Chileans are using to protest against the government and for the change of the constitution?
Yeah, so you mentioned, right, so Chilean feminists and Chilean women were really an active part of these demonstrations that started in October of last year, October of 2019. And, they're protesting, right? So they're doing the usual things, marching in streets and chanting and, using bullhorns. But they've also used sort of song and dance and art, and even art on their own bodies to make really important political points, right? So at other moments, women in Chile and other women in Latin America have even protested without their shirts on, right? Completely topless, to make sort of points about the importance of women's bodies in public spaces, and that their bodies are their own, and that what they're doing in public spaces with their bodies is their business, right? And nobody else's business. And also to make the point, so often when women suffer violence and harassment, people will say, oh, well, what were you wearing? What were you, what street were you walking on? You shouldn't have gone out so late at night, right? And so part of also protesting without your top on is a way of sort of saying that that's not it, right? That's not why women are assaulted. It's not the woman's fault that they're assaulted. So women in Chile, one of the elements they did as part of this protest was song and dance, and using their own bodies was a song about how, basically the rapist was next door and the rapist was you. And this really went viral, right? So this song has been now performed by women and feminists who have been marching in Europe, who have been marching in other Latin American countries. Again, speaking to my comment about how there is this kind of learning and there is this kind of sharing among these groups, especially with social media, because of course, violence against women, street harassment, is not just an issue that women face in Chile, but that they face across the globe. So that's been one really important aspect that's come out of this. And there are other, countries where women are also mobilizing and also protesting and sort of taking inspiration from their Chilean sisters.
Why do you think, though, society hasn't been more driven to try and get these issues into a bigger forum, the way the Chilean women are doing currently?
It sounds like you covered Bolivia on another podcast, right? So I think we do see moments, right, where countries are just brought to these points, right? They're brought to these points of the frog in the boiling pot, or the tip of the iceberg, or the straw that breaks the camel's back. And people do protest, right? In the US in 2016, right, on Trump's inauguration, I mean, we had the largest turnout for a single day of protest in the United States since the civil rights era. Now, of course, that record has since been shattered by our own protests around Black Lives Matter this summer, right? But I do think, I try to be optimistic that when we look across the globe, we really do see, to use another metaphor, when the rubber hits the road, right, people do come out, right? If you think about the U.S. and the protests around Black Lives Matter this summer, the long simmering injustices in the Black American community, again, the frog was boiled and people came out, right? Right now in Lebanon, in Belarus, in Hong Kong, we see similar movements where people are just coming together and using their voices. So I try to be optimistic that it can happen, but sometimes it does take a long time, right? The frog boils in the pot for a really long time, maybe because of the costliness of protest, right? That I was just talking about, because it's not free to engage in these kinds of activities, right? It takes your time, it takes your energy, it takes your safety, right? And so maybe you need sufficient incentives, right, to decide that you're ready to pay those costs and go out and protest.
It feels like this all happens only when something reaches a boiling point. I'm going to have to work on my metaphors here to get to your level, Jennifer.
I know, but the problem is I mix them up if I keep going. So, if we keep talking, I'll have some baby lambs in a pot and some frogs and driving in cars. I don't know.
Oh, awesome. So do you see the Constitution changing enough? Does Chile require more reform?
I think that's a great question. I mean, there's no doubt that Chile requires more reform, right? Changing the election system 5 years ago didn't get it done, right? Didn't do enough, right? Protest, and even in the weeks leading up to the referendum, right? Chileans sort of returned to protesting, right? Sort of put the pressure on for the referendum to come out in favor of change. So I think it's really going to just depend on who gets elected to this assembly. So I know that what I'm going to look for in the next year is to be who declares themselves to be candidates. There's nothing in the rules that prevent previous office holders from running to be candidates in the Constitutional Convention, right? We're calling it a citizens' convention to sort of emphasize that it's not current politicians who are going to write it. But there's nothing in the rules that says if you served in Congress 3 years ago that you can't ever run to be a delegate in the convention, right? So I think it's really going to depend on who runs. Will it actually be the waitress and the bus driver? Will it be the kind of what we would call the intelligentsia, right? Journalists, university professors, business people? Or will it actually just be, politicians who are able to run because they're not holding office at the moment, but they just served in Congress a few years ago? So I think it's really going to depend who's there. Right. And I think if it's a really diverse body in terms of backgrounds, in terms of identities, in terms of class status, it should hopefully be a document that is more expansive, that's more inclusive, that recognizes a broader set of rights for a broader set of people. But there's a long way from here and there, right? And so if you read the media coverage, there's a lot of sort of, as I said, hand-wringing about, now Chile's going to write some sort of, populist document. But we don't know, because we don't know who's going to run, and we don't know who's going to get elected. So I think there's a lot to continue to look out for.
It depends almost on so many factors that you've articulated beautifully this morning. And what you spoke about of who it depends on, is there concern how much influence the pro-business right and the small group still nostalgic for the Pinochet rule?
I think that we might see those groups in there, right? There's certainly political parties that represent their interests, but there's also a lot of political parties in the middle and the left of the ideological spectrum. I won't name names, but when I think of a lot of the feminist and women's movement leaders that I know that have been really pivotal in Chile and have been really pivotal to even getting the gender parity rules for the convention. I actually think some of them will run, right? I would be surprised if some of them didn't. So I think it really will depend on who decides that they actually want to be part of this process, right? And so I think there's still a lot of ways, as I said, that the rules tend towards stability, right? The 2/3 quorum for approving any element of the Constitution, the fact that at the end of the day, the candidates still have to run with political parties. That gives the traditional party leaders a lot of control over who the candidates are. So if you're on the side of sort of, clutching your pearls over this, I don't think you need to be clutching your pearls. But if you're on the side of, looking for the world's first anarchist document, I think you'll also be disappointed. I think it'll be somewhere in the middle.
Another little metaphor.
Another metaphor. Exactly.
We're almost going to have a little buzzer with how many you click or how many you say during the podcast. I love it.
That's right.
Oh, what would you be glad people knew about the Chilean changing their constitution? Or should I say the Chilean people changing their constitution? Yeah.
I think the whole process that we've talked about, I think we're at a moment globally, right, where there's a lot of questions about where democracy is going. And I think that the power of people to protest when they need to protest and bring about changes. Protest is democratic, right? It's a right to assemble. It's a right to raise your voice. And that we should be using that right. And that if we use that right, there might be some bad outcomes, right? There might be some property damage. But that it also can affect change and it also can get politicians' attention. And I think we see that in Chile. I think we see that in other cases. Again, if I think about the United States, right, the way our politicians now are talking about injustice for Black Americans in the wake of Black Lives Matter protests is so different than the way they talked about it before. It actually has made some real changes in the words and hopefully in the policies. So, as a political scientist, I'm like, make a difference, go out there, do it. I think people can do it.
Hopefully people can do it and we can create so much change. I would also love to know, Jennifer, what have been the big lessons that you've learned across your illustrious career in academia?
So I think the other thing I'd want people to know, and it's a big lesson for me, obviously, I focus specifically on the role of women, and we talked about how groundbreaking or radical, if you will, the Chilean Constitutional Convention is. But I think more what it shows, right, is that we need our political leaders to be responsive, as we've talked about, but we also need them to be representative. And we don't just need them to represent our policy interests, but we need them to represent who we are, right? So we know from research that when political leaders are more diverse, when there's more women, when there's more people of color, that actually citizens are more likely to trust their politicians. They're more likely to feel good about the kinds of political decisions their politicians make. So there really isn't good reasons that most political offices worldwide should still continue to be held by men of a country's ethnic majority group, right? That happens for historic reasons, but there's really important reasons to sort of make those changes. So a lot of my work has really been focused on, how do we get more women and underrepresented groups into politics? Because we know that is really part of the democratic project. And that can really prevent a lot of the reasons that people might need to go protest in the first place, right? In the United States, if more Black Americans were actually making our laws and our policies, maybe they wouldn't have discriminated against and caused so much harm to Black American communities, right? So I think the importance of thinking about diversity in our representatives is key.
I know you would know one of our friends of our podcast that we've had in a previous episode, Devin Phoenix, and he said something along those lines too, Jennifer. He said to stand up and speak up for those who don't have a voice.
Absolutely.
And hopefully together we can create a few changes in the world that makes our place so much more beautiful. So I'm very grateful for you helping us understand what is going on with the Chilean Constitution this morning.
Great. Thank you so much for inviting me. It was really fun to have this conversation.
Thanks again, Jennifer. Thank you for listening to the Glad You Knew Politics Podcast. If you haven't already, please subscribe to the podcast, leave us a rating and a review on what you thought about this week's episode, and any other questions you might have or issues you would like us to cover in future episodes. You can keep up to date with us and the podcast by following us at Glad You Knew on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn. Links are in the description below.